Today I wanted to discuss Carl Benjamin, the flippantly named Jargon and Facade, because the idea that this is the savior of the West in some way, in some fashion, has become a bit droll. It's a bit of a joke. And not necessarily because I don't think that some of the things he says are correct, but because of his apathetic milquetoast leniency towards action. It's that I'd rather talk about things. I'd rather things to be discussed civilly in this Englishman prototypical way. It's to say there's a way to do things and it has to be the Englishman way. And it's very pretentious and vapid. And I wanted to discuss it because whilst there are several things that I think he brings light to in good ways, it does bother me quite a lot that he has such a strong following, because how much of a dearth there is in critical and particularly against the leftist progressives online presence on current affairs. Current affairs in general are often carried mostly by media, legacy media like the BBC or Reuters or CNN, places like this, NBC. So they have the established narrative fixed by an editor and then carried away. Obviously, Carl has been successful in setting up what is nouveau media, which is much more centered around, say, millennials and younger generations who are equipped to subscribe to a certain different channel. It could be on YouTube, it could be on any number of Gumtree, I think, or Patreon, or whatever it is, that the way that you can disseminate your views to somebody. He's been able to do that through podcasting and as I say before, current affairs videoing. But this presents a lot of problems when you start to take the contraposition on a lot of these points against the mainstream media, and you start to blend what is your own politics, your own social commentary, all this punditry and commentariat stuff, blend it with what are the political forces at play, but then not really do anything with it. It's to say, I can draw attention and light to things, make a mockery of them, have you outraged by them, but really only to do it for clicks. I'm doing this just because that's my living. And that bothers me a little bit. I think you can't be the herald or a makeshift firebrand in the way that you are quite impotent in the actuality of it all. And as I say, he will go out and have a speech or do something like that. And he, I think, ironically almost ran for office in the European elections, the UKIP. But in general, if you are politically inclined, which I do believe that he is, given that he's spent his last 10 years from Gamergate to now trying to depose of the leftist, and this is the progressive mentality on a lot of these subjects. So I'll go through a long list here of just why Carl Benjamin's just not very good as a public intellectual or a politician, and is basically just providing alternate media. Nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that likens him quite more closely to someone like Ben Shapiro, who's got several issues that I won't go through here, and less of maybe the channel of English Anglo political, you want to say, anima, which was felt much more strongly with someone like Enoch Powell or Oswald Mosley, someone who has actual English spirit rather than just predisposition or proclivity for coziness. He's a jumped up Shire agent, basically, Carl is, which leaves a sour taste in my mouth. I think there is commendable things that Carl does, and the way that he's gone about building, let's say, a business or a media platform has been notable. But I think at the same time, using it in the way he does it's just rather servile and unconcrete in terms of actions. Will he be doing the same thing, talking about the same things in 10 years? Probably, because there's no actual progression here from his point of view. It's just I'm platforming the alternative view, the censored right-leaning or whatever have you. And that's not enough. That just isn't sufficient. You have to have some form of action, some call to a deed. There has to be something about what you're saying and telling people that allows you to connect them to what is an improvement, what is a betterment, what is this, let's elevate what we have to the next level. And this maybe comes back to his own metaphysical position, which he, in a video, has said that he is a materialist, and you can see it here. There's a very recent interview, as of his video, where he has basically avowed that he's not Christian, he's not in any way spiritual, he's not in any way inclined to theosophy or anything that would be considered non-atheist philosophy or religiousness, things like that. And this goes back to when I first encountered him, actually, which was many, many years ago. I'm not a fervent reader or believer or watcher, but I did encounter him in 2015 or 16 maybe, when he was talking about his love for John Locke and that period of Enlightenment thinkers. They call themselves liberal, and this goes into their politics as well as their idea of equality and the designation and the definitions, semantic play on freedoms and things like this, where it's a lot to talk about liberty and a lot to talk about freedom in that way that was important to John Locke and is different in its importance to us today. However, he likes to be, I think, a little bit special in the way that he delivers something where it seems as if it's a double entendre, as I'm talking about freedom, but not your kind of freedom, my kind of freedom, but also a little bit your kind of freedom. You see this double play here, trying to win an argument or at least a counter argument with himself. That is to say, I'm positioning something that could be true in two different ways such that I'll always be right, because even if you falsify and discredit my first claim, my second claim will be true because I'll just lean on the fact that John Locke said this and that, and he's a upstanding English liberal, and that's who I imagine myself to be. Now, I think hopefully that gives you quite a good overview of why I think Karl is the impotent weapon to disarm what is, I think, a proper movement. It's Nigel Farage 2.0, someone who bloviates a lot about things without actually positing anything. There's no propounding a certain policy measure. There's no, give it to Nigel Farage. He actually ran for politics basically throughout his life, and since he was in his 30s or something, now he's in his 50s or 60s. So I think Karl is even behind Nigel in that regard, and I don't necessarily think Nigel Farage is a good politician. He's a good rhetorician, and he has the ability to, I think, position himself quite well in politics, which is, I think, the sign of at least a competent politician. Whether I agree with his politics or, and that's an aside, and I don't think necessarily, you know that I probably don't, but this is to say my first point is that Karl's more obsessed with how he comes across, how we perceive him, and how he wishes he is perceived than being genuine and earnest. That is to say, he tries to affect a certain air, and that is this well-read, slightly, you could say, connected, late millennial, I want to call him, early Gen Xer vibe, where it's, look at me, I'm able to hold these sophisticated conversations while also being able to kick it with the layman and discuss those topics. And this ability to transgress these borders allows for me to be relatable, but also a sophisticated opinion piece and mouthpiece on certain topics. And I think that betrays a lot of his being, is that he wants to be something for everybody, and he wants especially you to think of him as something depending on your perspective. So if I'm poor and I'm an underclass worker, I think, wow, Karl's really educated and smart. I can kind of trust this guy to give me the good take. He gives me the hot take. And then I've been coming from the, say, middle class, more well-read, and say, look, finally someone who's actually also well-read discusses these topics in a way that I found resonates with me, which is, and there's nothing wrong with that in particular, but I think the idea that if it were me, then I would feel as if there was some sort of internal conflict here, where you can clearly see he's battling between who he wants to be and how he wants to be perceived. This goes into one of my more callous and more ad hominem attacks, is that Karl's spiritually fat, and you know how I feel about fatties on my channel. Karl himself only looks pudgy here, and I would say his porcine face is not necessarily indicative of current rotundness, but his clearly, and you can see physiognomically, tried to thin himself, but this belays what is, I think, a history probably of being overweight because you enjoy one too many pints and one too many biscuits, and that could be seen as very English, which I think he wants it to be, but I the way I always interpret Carl is very much like a hobbit. So he's read too much Tolkien. He's said, look, I perceive myself as being basically a hobbit. I want my life to be like a hobbit's life, in that cozy Shire feeling. I want my country to just return to this Shire and nothing to affect me. And I think the irony being obviously that even Tolkien in his way knew that whilst there's this picturesque, idyllic, sanctimonious version of the Shire where the hobbits live, it is necessarily violable by the evil forces, and there has to be some power that keeps them at bay. Talking and politicking and having a bunch of chinwag fests with your mates is not going to be sufficient. The third world hordes are endless and violent. So the only way to disperse them and to repel them is through violence, or at least the projection of force. Now, his solution to most of these things, as you can see here, is you need to vote harder. You need to make your vote count more. Or, as I did see in one of his videos, which was quite upsetting to me, is that he's parroting what is a simulacra of the accelerationist propaganda of let's go faster forward to death, then we can reset, which it might strike you as there's a logic to it. And I think that's the appeal, is that you could see the sense in, if I'm expecting a dropped ball to bounce and I want it to come back because I know it has to, then I want to bounce it early and I want to bounce it faster so that once it does hit, it actually comes back faster. This is not how societies work. Society is an organism. So if you want to see it crushed and skewered, then you'll see it dead before you see it come back. Once you go, no, let's just have it. Let's have the 10-year recession, as he says in this video in particular. Let's just get it over and done with, and then we can come back. Is not how at all a depression works. And it's not guaranteed that you do come back. If you have civil unrest to such large degrees, you have to overhaul society in unforeseen ways. You don't go back to a tradition of, look at what we were 100 years ago, now it's picturesque and bucolic again. It doesn't work like that, Carl. And I'm very sad or frustrated to actually have to see someone, at least with his modicum of professionalism, make that comment. It's just very insane. So this idea of his, there's a very first materialist, second accelerationist, and lastly this coping ancient Anglo-individualist liberalism. It just doesn't work. It's not a functional syncretic philosophy to live your life by. It's basically the antithesis both of dealing with the facts as they are. It's a bunch of normative wishes and wants. Wish it was like this, ought to be here and here, rather than this is how it is. This is how we deal with the problem. You must, in terms of bravery and courage, face these things with the risk that's commensurate to what you want out of it. You can't just vote and get rid of what are existential questions. Politics doesn't work like that, and power doesn't work like that, and particularly violence doesn't work like that. So it's very off-putting to have to see this guy just basically make the same speech, and he will be doing this for 5 more years, blah, blah, blah. You should think more about being an individual, blah, 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 if we all had the same expectations. And it's very easy to see how you win arguments with his rhetoric, because you go in with, oh, look at this meritocratic system, doesn't work. Look at this feminism, doesn't work. And that's because his instincts aren't that good. I don't want to say it's easy. It's not easy to do what he does in a lot of ways, but it does become, as you can see here, this. Because he spends clearly too much time on Twitter, as most quasi-intellectuals do, is to say, hey, let me see what Twitter's thinking. Let me put a microphone to Twitter. And then every episode of his daily podcast, or whatever it is, one of them, there's about 6 of his podcasts, so it's hard to keep track, is him just reading tweets. Now, I don't think of my content maybe as necessarily high production value, and I'm sure you'll all agree, me sitting here talking over a PowerPoint display every video or whatever is not necessarily that kind of effort. I don't bother with introductions, etc. But what I would say is that I try to make as much neotic effort, particularly cerebrally, around generating new angles, thoughts, ideas, things that you'll hear and say, at least this isn't something I've heard before. Or it's the application of a certain Spenglerian metaphysical morphology to a degree, or to a idea, or say to an affair, to a current that is being experienced by everybody, is to say, like, look, what is Trump? What does that mean from a Spenglerian position? Something like that, where I feel as if there's something unique I have to offer. But just general punditry on Twitter conversations is so perversely reductive, it becomes almost ironically bad. And I know that we all have this exhaustion with the left, and we like to hear anyone who actually has critical thinking applied to this madness. But at the same time, I think we have to have standards here. I think people need to realize that Carl is just going to feed you this slop, and it is by far and large 98% slop that he is feeding you over Lotus Eaters and this sort of stuff. I think when I was first seeing the YouTube sphere of this, it's, wow, Lotus Eaters, it looks quite unique in the way that they're delivering and they're talking on subjects that we see the news talk about, but in ways that it's actually much more sharper. But it becomes monotonous because you hear the same noise. You just hear the same lens applied to these very similar problems. Oh, it's one thing this week and it's one thing next week, and then they all blend into the same. And if you go back, which I don't think anyone would do, and watch any of those videos, because they're so reliant on it being breaking news or being the hot topic that it gets cold very fast. And I try to avoid that here on this channel and provide you with, if not perennial topics, at least transcendental ones that are applied across time in many different ways. And there's certain sects that would allow for understanding in different ways. So if you belong to one ideology, then you'll think about it in a different way, the way that I'm delivering the information, than someone else from another ideology. And that's what it amounts to in a lot of ways. In one video, he did say this, and I think it's worth taking an excerpt here. He was talking about whether he was seen as a white nationalist or white identitarian, and he was affronted, and he feels as if, no, look, and he has this idea of himself, I'm an Englishman, and an Englishman is ethnically this, and this is how I feel about myself, which firstly is a metaphysical position. It's not a materialist position. I think you can automatically do away with it. If you looked at his genealogy, is he actually 100% English or Anglo-Saxon? I doubt it. And I'm not saying that you can't identify as an Anglo-Saxon when you're just trace your family back 500 years in England, but this is beside the point. So one time he's actually saying that he has some metaphysical belonging, that he goes, no, look, I'm not just a materialist, even though later in the exact same video he says he is a filthy materialist. But he's saying that I don't believe in this whiteness, which he's like, and then he has a horrible metaphor here. He says anything could be white, and he points to light. You should really watch this. This is a shocking interview. And I think when you have a soft interviewer, an apologist to Carl, obviously you allow him to get away with anything because you're friends and you'll just discuss things. There's no critical analysis to it. But in general, it was a pathetic attempt to rebound or dissuade the conversation going down that I'm a white nationalist, even though I'm talking about things that are affecting only white people from the third worlders, because no one else is living through these problems. There really is only the first world, and the first world is only white, and the only people experiencing these things are the white man, the white race in that way. I don't necessarily like the terminology either, but I don't think it's a tyranny of categories that he goes on to describe it. Tyranny of category, by the way, if you don't know, is basically some form of taxonomy where they're saying you can't discuss something until it's categorized first. And apparently this is actually controversial. But if you can't categorize something, how can you discuss it? Because I can't agree, and this goes into Wittgensteinian language games. If you can't tell me something that I have a mutual understanding of, as in it's been categorized, as it's been a conceptualized idea to some degree, or a shared experience where we both have the same knowledge, then it's not discussable, and therefore it's not worth talking about. And you may as well at least define it so that we can talk about it. So there is categorization. I don't know why it would be a tyranny of it. It just is. It's just the function of language. That's how it works. You want to have the conversation, you have to talk on the same grounds. This is probably the basic, not even something good faith, but in just a mutual conversation. How do you have what is not a monologue, but a dialogue? So it's bizarre to me that he equates those two things. And I actually had to understand what he meant by tyranny of category, because it's such a perverse and disdainful notion of, no, we're being defined and restricted and oppressed by our own categorizing of language. No. I think leftists or like progressives actually do a good job of this, and they use language effectively, almost weaponized. No one's stopping you from weaponizing language. And I think that you should definitely do that instead of just behaving as if something that your enemy is doing is not a good thing. And that's just foolish, and no one would suggest that strategy. Oh, my enemy uses guns, so maybe I'll just use spears. No one would do this, right? The logic doesn't apply. So in any case, that's what his thinking was, is that I'm a English first. I don't care about the white man. I care about the English man, which is a revolting, I say, not just cowardice, because clearly he is worried about his door getting kicked down by the English police because he's posted something offensive. But in general, it's a betrayal. And it's a betrayal of the people who actually are affected by this. It's clear that he's less affected. He's upset, I think, in the general malaise. And in England in particular, there is a consensus around the cities that they just don't look English anymore, and I definitely agree with them. But English is correspondent to white because it has been for the last 1,000 years. So trying to blend or decategorize these things for only the reason of I don't want to be associated with white nationalists, is like, well, how about you just don't associate with them? It's not very hard. You can have the same ideas without being one. It's possible to share ideas with communists and not be a communist. Now, there are probably groundings which I would not share, and these are axioms around beliefs, and that could be something metaphysical like being a materialist. I find that if you would claim to be a materialist, you should be embarrassed that that was something that occurred to you to say, because a materialist is very soulless, and there's no other way around that. I think he would probably be best served to get a non-media job. I think he's probably experiencing like DEFCON 1 brain rot, and this goes in particular to his encapsulation of everything social media. Everything fed into him is almost like he's one of those, I would say, science fiction creatures that sits in a vat with all these tubes and plugs and information being piped in at infinite rates into him, and then having to come up with what are these good insights and these quips or these, you could say, critical analyses. And that just doesn't work. I think, for one, the input to output ratio is much more reliant on how much depth you have in your soul and your spirit, but also if you're well read in a certain direction, applying it, you could say, more grandly, more widely, more broadly. So because I'm so well read in Spenglerian metaphysics, but in general in, say, continental philosophy and all of these things, then you can hopefully, if you are, you can say, that well read, that much of a wonk on these subjects, then you can apply those things into all spheres of life, and that goes from economics to politics to sociology, but also human relationships, women, men, sports, media, entertainment, anything. But because Carl is obviously being suffocated by politics in that way, it becomes everything is politics, and everything is politics, but everything is specifically politics in this very unidimensional way, is why it's so exhausting for him. You can see it's a drain on him. And I think he thinks he enjoys it, but I really don't think he does. I think he should go outside and work in a farm for a year, come back, and maybe he'll have done that introspection and say, look, actually, I'm going to pick a side here. Because the problem with his claims is that he's heavily reliant on Aristotelian political and ethical theory. Now, if we consider ethical theory as one subject, so the agatha-cocological side is it good or is it bad? And we, in the West, in the Faustian West in particular, went through this with Nietzsche and get to a point where, no, actually morals are constructed by ourselves, and we can construct them in ways that we view as categorically imperative. It's not that there is a universal, unified morality, this ethical system, and it isn't just me being good is good, and all these consensus agreements around ethics that Aristotle was able to promulgate, which I think Carl obviously likes. It's very convenient for him to believe that. But Carl doesn't understand that Aristotle wrote in Greek for Greeks at a certain period of time, particularly the Apollonian man. The Apollonian man is capable of grasping Aristotle in a way that we never will be. They understood him in a way because their entire soul and being, this morphology of themselves, was shaped by it. So it's to say you can't have the same perspective. It's not possible to read the book and understand it in the way that they did. Not even the most highly empathetic or most creative, intelligent, imaginative person in the world could do this thing. It's not possible to transcend your entire soul being. And that's where I think he gives a bit of the game away, is that he doesn't feel Faustian maybe, or he's in denial about his Faustian will to the infinite power. I want to deny what is, I think, as avarice, or what I think is capriciousness, or some disgust in relation to this will for infinite power. Why would I want power when it's able to corrupt these men, these good people, and they turn sour. Or I can see all these other people vying for power who are ugly, who have that pugnacious, disgusting spirit to them. Why would I want that if they want that? Which is kind of why he's I don't say a loser, but he's emulating what is a losing mentality here. I think that then we can maybe just shuffle a little bit further into why I feel as if Carl needs to put the microphone down for a year. I think firstly maybe is his origin story. It's that peak internet era of you should have just let me play my video games. There's a both earnest and ironic, cheeky version of this where we say, look, I would have been happy just to sit at home playing my games, but you had to inject your politics in. Back then it was called social justice warrior politics, and now it's identity politics and whatever have you. But the idea was that there's games that we like to play as particularly as boys, and particularly as boys of a certain generation, we play these certain games, whether they're role-playing games or they're first-person shooters, whatever have you. And then women became in contact with these games and wanted to inject themselves into them, rightly or wrongly. And they did it in a way that was very feminine, and that has been rejected by a lot of the men or the masculine side of this hobby sphere, you could call it. And so I don't like having certain elements in my games that I didn't have before. If you go back in time, you see how games are constructed, and they're very traditional in their reflection of society as it was. You have, if it's a game set in Europe, only white people. If you have a game in war, it's only men. If you had a game in a hospital, then everyone's a doctor or a nurse. Something like this. You see how the reflection of the reality is something that was actually inspired to by the designer. Now, what happened was, as everyone well knows, is that there was a flipping of the hierarchical power dynamic here. Firstly, it was to say we introduced all these elements to what was a very understood and orderly version of a hobby, of a pastime. Some would go so far as to call it art, not high art, low art, but art in general. But then also how exactly I started to inject my own personal view, my identity into a game. And so game designers, if they were a brown woman, wanted the brown woman to be the lead of what would have ostensibly been the white male protagonist, the European heritage, whatever we want to say, which put a lot of people off. And you can see the design around games has now shifted, and there's been this hydra of different issues spawned out of this one thing of some progressives wanting to implement what they saw as their own morals into games, which actually does make sense in that way. If you understand morals here to be something where I have mine tacit, mine are just implied morals. It's the way that I just live. So it makes sense for me to have that as my lifestyle. So it can be confronting if you are a leftist progressive and you go into a game and it's a whole bunch of young men shouting slurs at each other in English. But in general, it's to say I want an atmosphere that I find conducive to relaxation or to pastime, partaking, some hobbying, whatever you want to say as a video game is to you, whatever it is to you, which is what they felt like they were missing. That's to say, I want to see this brown, fat, disabled lesbian as the main character because that's who I am, or I feel like representation matters and that's who I want to see in the game. And that ruined the experience for a lot of people. And this is the Carl Benjamin side. This is why he's spiritually fat, but he's also spiritually just a bit of a goofy dork. The idea that this mattered was such a tremendous and it was it sparked a fuse that was dynamic in how it unleashed what is the generation of, say, internet, particularly millennial men, as to say, I'm going to react to this in every way possible. So in every forum now, I'm going to push back on this, they call it woke now, but and this progressivism as a disease, as the liberal pathology towards making sure that everyone is seen in the equal ways because we're all equal, this egalitarianism, which ironically enough starts out of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and other French school of the Enlightenment period, where you have egalitarian and fraternity and things like this, where we can see men as men before the law as all they're equal. And this is the logical conclusion to that, is that you treat equality like that, then you'll get equality. We don't like it, evidently, because we realize that some degree of the progress meter here, that equality switched over to you shoving people who are very, very annoying in our faces. But nevertheless, Carl insists on being a classical liberal for reasons unbeknownst to me. But that is how he had his start, how he built his momentum on this. He was able to thrust back at the Anna Sarkeesian, I think her name was, of the world, where they want to take hold and use their power, whatever way fashion they had, to implore us to abide by their idea. So basically they were demagoguery, but from the left-hand side of the spectrum onto us and say, like, no, now you have to be accepting and progressive, because if you're not, I'm going to get you cancelled. And so there's a whole rigmarole here around cancel culture I won't bother too much with. But that's kind of forged him in this. I take my view on politics particularly and specifically from current events. The long way of his politics is there was here Grecian politics, Apollonian politics, huge gap, nothing. Then we have John Locke in the 17th century, I think 17th century, and then we have a huge gap, and then we're at modern times. And in no point in time in those intervening years did we have any other development politics that I consider worthy or noteworthy or worthwhile to pursue. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, obviously that we are now suffering through what is a very disjointed and incoherent and almost inchoate philosophy. It's just not well formed. It's not well thought through. And so what you get is just dribs and drabs of sensibility. And between these things is just whatever he thinks sounds good. Fine. But if his instincts are bad, and let me tell you, Carl Benjamin, you have bad instincts. The idea that you can just say, I wouldn't rape you, to a politician and think that that was a smart and clever response in any frame. And I get what he was trying to do. I don't think anyone didn't understand. And I think he was of this opinion. It's like, no, I can be edgy in a way that is just funny, and now you have to deal with it. And I think that I like the irony of this photo here where he's saying state forced individualism. His photoshopped head on top of Sam Hyde, who actually is the version of an edgy, you say comedian at this point, but an edgy political commentator, because his edge comes without the pretentiousness. There's no idea here that he's trying to promote something that he isn't, in a way that he feels as if he doesn't do it, he'll either go to jail or he'll be irrelevant. He'll be taken less seriously, less prestigiously. But what is prestige? What is status? Who are you appealing to? It'd just be natural. Like, if it was organic, I think he would actually be better in front of the camera. He would deliver messages that I would have to give a shit about. Otherwise, it really is just him sitting there for literally day after day after day as his job to scroll through Twitter and tell you about things he saw on Twitter. This is like an old man in a nursing home showing you YouTube videos in terms of things that I care about, relevance, but also appeal. I really think this is bottom of the barrel tier stuff. Now, I know that, as I said before, there's been a huge vacuum in the right-hand spectrum of anyone dealing with issues in a sensible and critical in its frame, but I am really depressed that it's come down to this. So the clickbait merchant, or the click merchant here, that's obviously his job, and in doing so, you set expectations. And if you're going to be on TV, which is a portrayal of a TV, a simulation of a TV, something we think of modern TV as, it's just the internet, then you'll have to be up to date to earn money. You have to be publishing every day. I don't give a shit about money. Why would I want to publish things that I don't care about and have to talk to anything always at all times? You think about streamers. This person's life is so meaningless to them. The time is only consequential if it's related to money. I could not imagine a more pathetic materialist existence, but obviously this appeals to some people. It's not to say like, well, I would say your ambition should be to be someone a bit more like PewDiePie, who went through a transformation of being a dorky young YouTuber into being what is now a much more mature man. I don't think his, once again, philosophy or metaphysics or anything like that is something necessary to be admired in those ways, but he's definitely done the right way of, if you wanted to be a famous internet YouTuber, I guess is the eponym, then this is the way to do it, is you successfully grow who you are alongside your audience. But I think Carl has been in this quagmire. He's been arrested in his development. It's just stuck. It's going to be him commentating on current affairs in his snide, chair, sitting there with a misplaced sense of superiority. I don't know where he gets it from. I think for me, the two biggest reasons why that smugness is a bit repugnant to me is that he clearly lacks curiosity, like genuine curiosity. There's a difference between someone trying to know as much as they need to know to win, say, an argument, versus someone who needs to know as much as they want because they have an inexhaustible curiosity to themselves. They just have a well that can never be filled by knowledge. And this is, if we're going to take a nice analogy here, it's Mimir's well, right? That we want to all sup from it. And once we have that sucker, we have knowledge, but it's never all the knowledge. It's only certain parts. And this piecemeal knowledge is going to give us and taste it, and then we want more, and insatiably we continue to strive for it. This has two different connotations around the delivery and around the praxis, just around the overall appeal of someone like, and I would say thinker like Carl. Once again, I do think Carl does some good stuff. I don't want to be so negative here, but this really is a critique of his channel. So the message has to be like, how do you fix these things, Carl? How do you become, I guess, the man you wanted to be, this English gentleman who just wants his country back? Then you have to adapt to what the facts are. You have to embrace what's needed in the country at the moment in time. They need someone like Nigel Farage, but with actual vision. So they need someone who can deliver speeches, who can buff them up. You have to understand that the English are, first and foremostly, private people. And so that every one of them individually needs to think things, and then they can agree with them afterwards, like a nexus with its nodes in conjunction, interconnected along these vector lines. But in the other way of this, it's to say you have to represent what is the nexus here. Is everyone has to connect to you individually, and the only way to do that for the Englishman is something like Cromwell, or you go the other way and you have to have this universal appeal. Carl doesn't have universal appeal, so he has to do the Cromwell way, and you can't do the Cromwell way when you're a pretty thin-skinned, I don't say rubbernecker, but you've not got the warrior mentality. He's just not a natural-born killer. And you need to be that killer. Like, I don't know what to say. If you want to be a politician in our day and age, and you want to fight for what's right, and you want the might in that way, the might is right, then the Ragnar Redbeard spirit has to be channeled into you, and you say, look, I'm going to take it by force. And by force here is you can be democratic. But you have to be very specific and ardent and strident. You can't be this flip-flopper, weak-willed, I would say, squeamish or smarmy man. It doesn't work. And this is why you have so many people on both sides get a bit tired and a bit, I would say, exhausted by his presence, by his inane mutterings and meanderings. I think then, lastly, maybe to round off, we will just go into how his inability to channel what is, I think, the Faustian spirit is his ultimate downfall here. He's so Anglo-centric in a way that's not actually appreciative of what the Anglo spirit is. Rather, it's the derivative of it. You've taken what is a diluted version of Anglo might. Why was the British Empire grand at any point in time? It's the piratical nature of the Viking, that he had this will to infinite power, and he deployed it in ways that saw him grow to 1/4 of the entire surface area of the earth. This is a small island nation of, at that time, like 10 to 20 million people. How is that possible? Well, it's possible only if you have a collective spirit that allows you to do these things. That is an Anglo spirit. That's something you want to conjure, something you want to have inside of you, burgeoning up and out, and then delivering that to all your readers and your crowd, whatever it is, your adulating fans. Not this armchair commentariat sitting there, as I said before, snidely reading Twitter. This is not the same thing. None of these people would have done this. They were out there on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Africa and Central Asia. They were doing, even North America, South America, they were doing the things in violent ways and then administering them afterwards. They were taking the risks for the rewards. Here, he doesn't even want to defend his country with anything other than some soft-spoken, vote harder words. This is not enough. It's ineffectual and it's impotent and it's effete. And I think, Carl, you seriously need to reflect on this and go, no, actually, action starts and stems from me, and I'm the one that needs to spark some ignition here if I want to have my name remembered, or I actually want what I say I want, which is I want my country back.